Hey everybody, in this video we are going over the 7 best ideas from Tribe by Sebastian Junger, coming right up. And before we get started, a happy Memorial Day shout out to everybody, all my military, veterans, everybody who's close to a veteran. I'm in the military myself, and that was a big draw for me to this book. It's a lot about military, about integration with culture, about how we bond when we're in a military environment, about how after that you want to come back and be back in part of normal society with civilians and how that all works. That's a huge interest to me. That's a huge interest to the Navy. This book was on the Chief of Naval Operations reading list. That's our big 4-star admiral, his reading list. And because of that, I actually reached out to Sebastian Junger. I'm going to be doing an interview with him shortly, probably next month. So be sure to subscribe to see that interview with Sebastian Junger. And with that, let's kick it off. Key idea number 1 is the game of ideas. That's what Sebastian Junger says he did when he came up with the theme for this book, with this idea of a tribe. I think he was talking about it on either Joe Rogan's podcast or Tim Ferriss's podcast, and he said that it's this game of ideas, that he had this idea that he'd heard from a mentor growing up that early pioneers, early American settlers would sometimes be captured by Indians after a conflict, or they might run off and join the Indians, and then they wouldn't want to go back. And sometimes settlers would go and they would find these people and they would try to liberate them from the Indians. They would think, come back to us, come back to our society. And these people would say no. Or these people would run away and go back to the Indian society, that that's where they wanted to be, that this was so attractive to them. And then at the same time, on a very similar path, he noticed that there were people who he was going out and seeing real war with, people he was out in Afghanistan with. He was a wartime journalist, and he'd be out there with soldiers, and then they'd get back to a comfortable, cushy society life, and they'd want to go back to war. They'd miss the war. They'd miss all of that. They'd miss these seemingly more difficult tribal existences, and that these two things can play together. This game of ideas is so interesting to Sebastian Junger. It's so interesting to this book. The second key idea is that depression actually increases in more affluent society. That's what we're seeing in our more affluent, more comfortable societies, and that this may be due to a lack of inter-reliant community. That means that we don't actually rely on our neighbors anymore, and that's part of the reason that we end up depressed, that we end up pursuing this American dream of having the perfect little plot of the perfect little house where we have the nice 3-car garage and we can just roll right in, and it's kind of like the Bat Cave. Like you push your garage door opener, you go into the garage, you shut the door behind you, and none of your neighbors will ever see you. You're in your car, you get all the way in, and then you're closed in and you're locked in your house, and you are nice and safe in your perfect, cozy little spot, and you don't cross paths with anybody, and you don't know your neighbors. That this makes for a lack of inter-reliant community, a lack of depending on each other, and in fact, we end up more depressed, and we're doing everything ourselves. It used to be that you'd rely on one person to be getting food and one person to do the washing and all that, and now we're doing everything ourselves. We're making our own food, we're doing our own washing. Even when we go to the grocery store now, we're our own checker and bagger at the self-checkout. We're not crossing paths with people in the same way. There isn't this inter-reliant community that we used to have, and that leads to depression. The idea number 3 is that prosocial acts actually make us feel good with dopamine and oxytocin. These are good feeling hormones, and when we make prosocial acts, when we work together on something, we get these hormones going. So if we collaborate, if we come together on a project with our neighbors, with our peers, and we work on something as we're going along in that, as we're making progress in that project, we're getting little hits of dopamine along the way. We're getting a little bit closer to the end, we can see the results coming, and we get that dopamine going, and it feels good. At the same time, we're working with these people, we're coming together, we're bonding, we're learning, we're growing together, and we get this oxytocin going. We get this good feeling, this loving, bonding hormone with people. We're working together, we're coming together on something, we're unified, and so we get this dopamine and oxytocin, and that feels so good. Key idea number 4 is that this social, adaptive, tribal behavior is reinforced in a lot of ways, not just in the hormonal, which is one way that we just talked about, the dopamine and the oxytocin, but also emotionally and culturally. So emotionally, we just feel more pleasant. It's good for our emotions. We end up more emotionally stable if we are in this kind of environment where we're relying on other people, we're talking to other people, we're working things out with other people. We know that we've got somebody to count on, so we can feel safer as part of the group. All of these things are better for us emotionally. And then culturally, we just do better as a culture if we're relying on other people, if we're working together, if we're collaborating, if we're bringing together what we all have to the table. Then culturally, we flourish, we do better in this. So it's better for us hormonally, we get that good brain chemistry, emotionally, we feel safer, we feel better, and culturally, as a culture, we do better as well when we have this good social adaptive behavior. Key idea number 5 is that sometimes a disaster can be good. Right in the opening of this book, Sebastian talks about how growing up, it was in these dull labor jobs, and sometimes he would wish for a disaster, wish for something that people could come together and rally around. And he highlights an example of an earthquake in Italy where the people said, an earthquake achieves what the law promises but does not in practice maintain: the equality of all men. Meaning that when we have a disaster, when something terrible strikes us, that it can actually level the playing field, that it can mean that suddenly when there's an earthquake, the earthquake doesn't care if you're rich or poor or black or white or a Democrat or Republican. None of these things matter when the earthquake strikes. Suddenly, we're all very human, we're all very aware of that, and people will naturally bond together. These disasters, these terrible things can be good and can bring about the ideals that we're so bent on in this country, that we are about equality and the value of all people, and that all comes together when we're in a disaster, when we're in dire circumstances, when everybody bands together to make something happen. Key idea number 6 is that contempt is toxic. And this is something that is very well known and documented in research on married couples or soon-to-be married couples. If there is contempt, that is one of the 4 horsemen of the doom of that relationship. Contempt is the biggest one. Contempt is the biggest predictor of the end of relationships. And that's in married couples. That's the research of Dr. John Gottman, among others. But it also applies to society. If you have 2 sides who just have total contempt for each other, rather than seeing that they need each other in a society, if you have, say, a bipartisan system, or one side is saying, well, you're so bad, you're so terrible, you're trying to ruin everything, you're the worst, you're dangerous, we need to cut you out. And the other side is saying, you're so bad, you're so terrible, you're so dangerous, we need to cut you out. There's this contempt, there's this lack of understanding for the other, and that is toxic. And that's toxic in a tribe, that's toxic in a group, that's toxic in a family, that's toxic in a relationship. And Dave Chappelle, actually, of all people, has really interesting insights on this. I saw a clip with him a few years ago. He had just come back after some issues with mental illness, and he said that the worst thing that you can call someone is crazy, because then you have contempt for that person. You're saying, I don't understand you, so I'm going to write you off. I'm going to say you're crazy. You assume this moral superiority when you have contempt for someone. You assume that you know something, that you have it all figured out, and they don't. They're crazy. I'm going to write them off. And that is toxic for relationships, toxic for groups, and that we need to watch out for that, because it's actually harmful to the fiber of our society, of our groups, of the things that we're all striving toward. Key idea number 7 is that people who are having a hard time, especially vets with PTSD, will do much better to be needed, to be integrated, to be relied upon, to be brought back in to a society, to be leaned on, to be part of the group. When those situations happen, when people feel needed, when they feel integrated, then they tend to flourish. So back to the tribal society, back to the Indians that Sebastian highlights so much through this book. He says that they would go off to war, and then they'd come back and people wouldn't be like, oh, well, now you're a vet, you've been through so many terrible things, and we see you as kind of different, and who knows if you're safe to be around. Instead, they would say, oh, great, you're part of the team, you've gone off, you've fought for us, we're grateful for that, and now we need you to come back and work the fields. We need you to do what we need. We need you to be part of this society, part of this team. And this comes in so many other cases. He highlights the bombings in Europe during World War II and how people who were mentally ill and had serious problems, all of a sudden in that moment of need, they became the ambulance drivers. They were going around and taking care of people. Or how after a tragedy like 9/11, veterans who had PTSD, especially Vietnam vets, all of a sudden their symptoms seem to diminish. They actually seem to get better after a stressful situation like 9/11, because people were bonding, people were coming together in that moment. And if you've ever read or seen American Sniper, the story of Chris Kyle, again, another story of a veteran who just wanted to be needed, who wanted to serve, who wanted to help people. And that opportunity can make things so much better for people. So this year, Memorial Day, keep these things in mind. You could say thank you for your service, and that's great. Or maybe you could ask somebody to lend you a hand, or you could listen to somebody. There's a lot that we can do to integrate people, to bring us all together, and to make for more unity in our society. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I'm so excited to be interviewing Sebastian Junger. We're going to talk a lot about this book. If you have questions for Sebastian, if you have suggestions, if you have things you want to know, or if you want to give him a shout out or anything, please be sure to leave that down in the comments. Let me know. I look forward to it, and I'll catch you next time.